Lots of people have been talking about the drug Ivermectin. Is it a wonder drug that can be used to treat COVID-19? Or is it just another unproven claim by fantasists and conspiracy theorists? Or is there something more interesting than either of the two extremes that would be worth looking at? Well, let's take a look. For the avoidance of doubt, nothing in this video constitutes medical advice. Of course! Indeed, you should never take medical advice from YouTubers, regardless of the expertise that they may claim for themselves. In this video, I look at the issues around ivermectin in the context of public policy and in the context of what we do and don't know. YouTube explicitly forbids the promotion of ivermectin for COVID-19 in its community guidelines. It has exclusions to that for discussions of a documentary and public policy nature, and I'm taking it that that exclusion applies here. It should do. Well, we'll just have to take the risk because these are the discussions that we should be having. Let's start with India. Daily death counts for COVID-19 there continue to be high. Reported numbers of cases has started to decline in a number of states, although for both figures you have to factor in the unreliability of the data from India. Only deaths in hospital were being counted, for instance, at a time when hospitals were being forced to turn away significant numbers of people. One aspect that hasn't been much reported is that several Indian states, with vaccine programs massively behind where they would need to be to make a dent on current cases, have now started mass prescribing the use of ivermectin as a prophylactic. A prophylactic is something you take before you get something to either prevent it from infecting you or reducing its impact if it does. The states of Goa and Uttarakhand are giving it to large amounts of their population to attempt to ward off future outbreaks. Leaders of both states said that their recommendations were evidence-based, and they'd been advised by an expert panel which had pointed to reduced recovery times and reduced risk of death. According to the Indian website Down to Earth, the second COVID wave has made one drug nearly a household name. Ivermectin is being prescribed much more liberally than national guidelines suggest, and there is no discernible evidence of how effective this common antiparasitic is in combating the pandemic. Now, this is an interesting area because on the one hand, the drug is one of the list of things that conspiracists and other excited commentators talk about, making claims that it's a super drug and going way into fantasy land in how they do so. But at the same time, when you're in a moment when all speech that deviates from what the WHO recommends is considered to be de facto dangerous, you can easily end up in the place where necessary discussion gets forbidden. And on that score, YouTube went even further, taking down a video earlier this year that was of Dr. Pierre Corey, an advocate for the drug, who was testifying to the US Senate. Which is just crazy. YouTube taking onto itself a decision that it can decide which public testimony to the government you're allowed to see. And it remained pretty unapologetic. We enforce our community guidelines consistently, regardless of speaker and without regard to political viewpoints. In accordance with our COVID-19 misinformation policy, we removed the two videos in question. We could spend a long time talking about the chilling effects of that particular act of censorship. It would take us rather off topic. So instead, let's look at what's prompting the debate and why it's become high profile again. Ivermectin is a drug for the treatment of parasite conditions. It was discovered by the Japanese biochemist Professor Satoshi Omura, who has spent his life searching for bioactive compounds in naturally occurring microorganisms. He was jointly awarded the 2015 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for discovering a strain of bacteria that produces the compound avermectin, which was used to develop the drug ivermectin. It's used today against river blindness, lymphatic filariasis, scabies and other parasitic infections that you probably don't want to have. It's been used for nearly 50 years and it has a very good safety record in its standard use context. Now bear in mind, something that's safe for one use doesn't automatically mean it's safe for another use. It can be, you just can't automatically assume so. Ivermectin is now off patent, so can be made easily and cheaply. Another reason why it will appeal to Indian states right now. Let's just track the history of how it emerged into the COVID-19 conversation in the first place. Because your first question would probably be something like, well, how can something that works against parasites have anything to do with virus infections? Which would be a good question. The first note of interest was back in 2012, blissfully well before any of us had heard of COVID-19. This paper by Wagstaff et al., published in the Biochemical Journal, identified that ivermectin inhibited a key mechanism used by some viruses, specifically HIV and dengue virus, to invade cells. So when SARS-CoV-2 appeared, it shouldn't be a surprise that it occurred to Wagstaff, based at the University of Monash in Australia, to do the same test with the new virus. They reported in a paper in March 2020 that within 48 hours of exposing infected cells to a dose of ivermectin, there had been around a 5,000-fold reduction of viral RNA, resulting in the effective loss of active viral material. An early report like that is encouraging, but scientists will know that because something shows that affecting in vitro doesn't necessarily mean that anything dramatic happens in the actual human body. That was reflected in the article on WebMD website reporting the study. At that point, before any of this had become overly politicised, the study was given an appropriate level of welcome by some of the experts. Jill Weatherhead MD, Assistant Professor of Adult and Paediatric Infectious Diseases in Baylor College of Medicine, said that the study certainly piqued our interest. They stressed that the important caveat was that it was done in a lab, but at this point any lead needed to be investigated. What we really need to know is, could you translate that concentration of the drug used in the lab study into human studies and have it be safe? And that's a relevant question because of the dose. The in vitro experiment used a dose 15 to 30 times higher than the normal dose of ivermectin used for other purposes. Like I said, something that's safe in one context may not be safe in another. Catherine Selle-Ratke, PhD, a professor of chemistry and biochemistry at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, said this: ivermectin has shown effectiveness against other viruses, despite being an antiparasitic drug. But she added that the findings were very preliminary. So, of course, that immediately hit Twitter with messages such as, for the past 2 days, various articles say ivermectin is a safe, FDA-approved and study claims it kills corona in less than 48 hours. And you can see the Chinese whispers already kicking in, since it's dropped the mention of the in vitro part, implying we might have a drug ready to go with no further issues. And before long, the phrase miracle cure starts to appear. So, for instance, quoting this relatively sober ABC News tweet, saying accurately, with the emergence of 2 preliminary studies yielding promising results, experts are expressing cautious optimism. But that was being shared with tweets like, could this head lice killer ivermectin be the miracle drug? Following from that, 2 things started to happen. First, the first clinical trials for the drug started to be registered. The very first one was by Baghdad University on the 13th of April. Then there were 3 in Egypt, 1 in India, and 2 US universities. These tended to be doctor-initiated trials rather than full-scale clinical trials, and that's key in terms of the amount of influence that they might have. And with the exception of the US universities, all the trials were in poorer countries, indicating an interest in an inexpensive drug such as ivermectin in meeting the crisis. The second thing that happened was that a number of countries, faced with a worsening pandemic, began to use ivermectin off-label. By June 2020, ivermectin had been added to the treatment guidelines of Bolivia, Guatemala and Peru on the basis of a preprint paper by the company Censorship. As it turned out, that Censorship paper, ivermectin in COVID-19 related critical illness, ended up being discredited and then finally retracted. The Censorship database was refused to be shared and its integrity came under serious doubt. Medical experts who saw precious real evidence to support the drug started to sound the alarm. particularly as government officials in some Latin American countries publicly endorsed the drug, leading to a surge in dangerous actions, particularly some citizens self-administering using the doses used in veterinary applications, which, is along the same levels as that couple who badly damaged themselves in the US by self-medicating with, fish tank cleaner? Because of a rising volume of concerns, Peru ended up withdrawing its recommendations a few months later. So that's a confused situation. In principle, the drug inhibits the development of a virus. There's a strong debate over whether that's effective at the normal doses that have been proven safe, and there's no safety information at the higher doses. Some people think it's a wonder drug, and there isn't time to muck about with proper procedure because there's a pandemic. Others are saying that's how you go seriously wrong in these situations, and you have to be cautious. Ivermectin was developed and owned originally by the pharmaceutical company Merck, although it's now off patent. Kitasato University in Japan asked Merck to conduct the full-scale clinical trials of ivermectin for COVID-19 because the company has priority to submit an application to wider the applications that the drug can be used for. If it had conducted a clinical trial, it would have been able to do so very quickly, in consultation with all the regulators, the NIH, the CDC, the FDA. Instead, it responded to that request saying that it had no intention of carrying out clinical trials. Why would it do that, you might ask? Some have suggested that they have an interest in that they're developing MK-4482, a nucleoside analogue that suppresses SARS-CoV-2 in a similar way to remdesivir. But unlike remdesivir, it would be a drug that you could take in tablet form, not necessarily as an injection, so it could be used by people in their own homes. The patent for ivermectin has expired, so could the company see it as competition for their new drug, which would be expected to bring significant profits? Now, we don't know if that's the case. Mind reading people is hard. I always discourage it, and assuming corporations are always motivated by selfish intent is often shown to be wrong. But more often than not, companies follow incentives. And the big problem of the pharmaceutical industry has always been that it grapples with misaligned incentives. It's an industry that produces life-saving products, for goodness sake, and yet it has one of the poorest public reputations you can find. That's an indicator of how badly this plays out sometimes. On the 4th of February 2021, Merck released a statement saying this: company scientists continue to carefully examine the findings of all available and emerging studies of ivermectin for the treatment of COVID-19 for evidence of efficacy and safety. It is important to note that to date our analysis has identified 1. No scientific basis for a potential therapeutic effect against COVID-19 from preclinical studies. 2. No meaningful evidence for clinical activity or clinical efficacy in patients with COVID-19 disease. And 3. A concerning lack of safety data in the majority of studies. Some have argued it's hard to square that statement with evidence to date, and their refusal to undertake the exact research that would provide the robust information that they say is lacking. But at the same time, it could have just been the company's attempt to defend itself from potential future liability claims arising from off-label uses of the drug. Either way, the statement was taken as hugely important in the public discussion, with it being quoted as though the company was an authoritative product owner summarising the latest state of the knowledge, rather than as a company passing comment on what, to all intents and purposes, might be considered a competitive product. The thing is, they're probably not wrong about the quality of much of the current evidence. Looking closely at the protocols of the small trials in these developing countries, all of them are doctor-initiated. The trials are small because they don't have the funding. Complete blind tests are not possible. You're generally not able to carry out tests involving multiple expensive PCR tests. That said, the first clinical trial results were reported from a study at the Broward Health Medical Center in Florida. It compared mortality between a 173 study group receiving ivermectin and a 107 control group receiving only conventional care. The mortality rate of the ivermectin group was 15%, which showed improvement that was significantly different from the 25.2% of the control group. Improvements were particularly strong in severe cases. The mortality rate of 38.8% in 49 patients treated with ivermectin was found to be significantly better than that of 80.7% in the 26 patients without treatment with ivermectin. Encouraging results, but small sample sizes. It was reported in a preprint, which is a prior to peer review, on June 9, 2020. And some attacked it for being just a preprint, but it was duly published properly after peer review in October. Salim Reze, an emergency medicine physician at Greater San Antonio Emergency Physicians, discussed the various ivermectin studies on his blog, Rebel EM. His verdict was the data still inconclusive, and he highlighted the problem with having only smaller studies. We've seen lots of poorly done studies initially with other drugs, only to show no mortality benefit when done in better done randomized clinical trials. I don't think physicians have a misunderstanding of the science, but they so badly want a treatment option for a terrible disease, it seems we, doctors, continue to do the same thing over and over again. You would see that there was enough material here to think that setting up major clinical trials would be desirable. But this is where the politics begins to come in. The heat of a pandemic is also peak Trump. And the fact that the president had decided to become a fan of a specific medication, hydroxychloroquine, and he'd made a number of other ill-advised off-the-cuff comments on the wider subject, that had led to an environment where hostility towards remedies that gain popular currency, being championed by random figures, for many people that was just a thing that you were going to be against. Those people were kind of the same as the ones who crept into empty hospital outpatient areas, saying, "Look how empty it is, it's all a hoax." We've talked before about how such attitudes led to a dismissive attitude to the lab leak hypothesis for the origin of the virus. And so arguably it had its influence here as well. And characters did indeed step forward. I already mentioned YouTube took down a video of the president of the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance, Pierre Corey, testifying to the Senate. YouTube said it did so because of misleading claims. And they weren't entirely alone. A paper penned by Corey and other members of the FLCCC was rejected by the Frontiers in Pharmacology journal. The journal noted that the article made a series of strong, unsupported claims based on studies with insufficient statistical significance. It also criticised the authors for promoting their own specific ivermectin-based treatment. The journal denied its action had anything to do with the respectability, or otherwise, of actually supporting ivermectin. Frontier's chief executive editor, Frederick Fenter, issued a statement saying this: Frontiers takes no position on the efficacy of ivermectin as a treatment of patients with COVID-19. However, we do take a very firm stance against unbalanced or unsupported scientific conclusions. It's not that the Frontline group carried no weight at all. On the 6th of January 2021, members of the group presented their findings to the US National Institutes of Health, the NIH, which prior to that point had a public position sceptical of the value of ivermectin. Following the meeting, the guidance was changed to neutral. There are insufficient data to recommend either for or against the use of ivermectin for the treatment of COVID-19. Results from adequately powered, well-designed and well-conducted clinical trials are needed to provide more specific evidence-based guidance. So that same message again, but no one seems to be in a hurry to actually do it. Why not? Well, speaking for the UK's recovery trial programme, Caroline Wood told the British Medical Journal that the UK advisory panel recommending treatments for large trials were unconvinced of the biological rationale for an antiviral effect. They felt the evidence of a clinically relevant anti-inflammatory effect was weak, and that the current clinical evidence and meta-analyses were not sufficiently robust to recommend ivermectin for further study. Recently, the pressure has been increasing, with the publication of a couple of papers highlighting what they believed to have been an inadvertent experiment in the use of ivermectin as a prophylactic in the real world. They identified that ivermectin is already being used as a prophylactic in a number of African countries, the intent being to prevent parasitic infections as per the drug's common use. But if you look at the instances of COVID in the African countries where ivermectin is used as a prophylactic and compare it to those where it isn't, there seems on the face of it to be a strong correlation. Countries where ivermectin is used see lower rates of incidence of COVID, so far anyway. This graph has had some wide currency because it shows the effects so graphically. Again, the authors of this study make only cautious claims, and you should too. Correlation is not causation. And when you're talking about what does or doesn't lead to COVID taking hold in a population, there are many potential variables that could be in play. You can't just look from a distance and assume that the one thing you're interested in is definitely the active factor. But they do present it once again as another piece of evidence that makes the case that you should be carrying out the study. And it gets to the point where to ignore the positive indicators, limited as they may be, means that you actually create consequences. By refusing to conduct the big study, you lead people then to go around you and take their own action. On the 5th of March, the US Food and Drug Administration issued a warning on the use of veterinary ivermectin. The FDA has received multiple reports of patients who have required medical support and been hospitalized after self-medicating with ivermectin intended for horses, it said in a statement. Don't take medicine for horses. Now, meanwhile, we have those 2 states in India that have decided to begin the process of deploying ivermectin as a prophylactic. And some have been writing about it as though it's a wacky and dangerous thing to do. But as we now know that a number of African countries were legitimately doing this already, so long as the doses match what they were doing, presumably there's no outright harm in that. I mean, the danger is that the population then believes they're taking the drug, so they're definitely safe and they don't have to take any of the usual precautions. And so far, none of the studies suggest that you would be advised to take that attitude. India also stands as an example of the dangers of alternative approaches to medication, since it is now afflicted by a major onset of what's called black fungus. Black fungus is a horrible disease with a mortality rate of 50%, and for many of those who survive, a very strong chance of losing one or both eyes. It's supposed to be rare. They used to see only 1 or 2 cases per year. But apparently it's now been striking former COVID-19 sufferers 12 to 18 days after recovery. Why? 2 hypotheses. One is that there's a link with the steroids that have been being used to treat COVID there. The other is that the use of industrial oxygen canisters might be to blame. With so many hospitals having to turn patients away as they were swamped, lots of people have been using oxygen at home. And although industrial oxygen is more pure than the form used in hospitals, the cylinders that it comes in are not kept in medically appropriate conditions. Either way, in Western societies where all the treatments for COVID are on label and the equipment used is appropriate, we're not seeing that effect. In an environment where people are desperate, have few options and use whatever they have that might work, then you start to see the unfortunate consequences you can get. Are they wrong to do it? Of course not. They don't really see themselves as having much choice. That's why the world has to be serious about getting COVID support to the poorest countries where it's needed. Now, hopefully the action by the Indian states on the ivermectin prophylaxis doesn't fall into this category. If it's properly managed, like the countries in Africa that have been using it already, then it needn't be. And you might have seen some of the internet stories on this subject and be wondering about them, because some have been spreading messages saying India has started to prescribe ivermectin and its cases of COVID-19 are plummeting. Well, you should smell a rat immediately because of the hubristic language. Those messages started appearing before those states had even begun actually rolling out the ivermectin. They would have had to be delivering the first doses to every single citizen on the day of the announcement for there to be any chance of cause and effect, and of course they weren't. And the graphs that they show of the states that have made that decision with the downward curve of cases, and then they compare it with the states that haven't made the decision, regular viewers of mine, what would be the first thing you would check with that from past history of things we've talked about? Obviously, they are cherry-picking the states concerned. Of course they are. There are a number of states where the cases are going down, where ivermectin is not being circulated. The point is, it's way too early anyway to be expected to see any real differences from a programme of prophylaxis. So where does all that leave us? We don't know. We need to see a proper full-scale trial. Now, maybe we're about to make some progress in that regard. The University of Minnesota has added ivermectin to its forthcoming major randomized trial program. It's currently seeking to recruit over 1,000 patients. And it's interesting. See how this was reported. Controversial ivermectin added to University of Minnesota COVID-19 drug trial. It should be the opposite of controversial to carry out a study. That should be the least controversial thing you can do. Ivermectin is a very well-established drug. It's not a controversial thing in itself. It's something about the mindset that we've got into on all of this. The people who hold that this is purely a thing that's promoted by the wacky conspiracy theorists, they are wrong. That said, it's arguable that the actual wacky conspiracists made it harder, not easier, for it to be accepted. Also, the people that hold that it's a wonder drug, and if everyone takes it, COVID will go away, that is not supported because the quality of the evidence we have to date is not good enough to bear the weight of that claim. Now look, it's not 100% impossible, but if you believe it to be something without evidence, you should be clear you're engaging in wishful thinking. You are not following the evidence. Now, initially, I wasn't interested in this area because it seemed to me people just randomly picking favourite drugs to support. Anything, really, so long as it wasn't officially approved. I became interested because it became evident that there was a different story here. The politicisation of something that should be apolitical. And the potential corruption of an area where the industry incentives are to follow the novel drug solutions rather than the off-patent, plentiful and cheap ones. While there's no proof to any of it, like the lab leak hypothesis, it's starting to look like an area where there should be some hard questions being asked.